What's going on, everyone? GoodMicWork commentaries back at you with an extremely somber episode to get into tonight. As most of you know, the Vice channel has kicked off its second season of Dark Side of the Ring. The first season was very successful, and when they announced the second season, they gave us an entire episode list of what to expect. And the very first episode was going to be a doozy, a whopper two-part episode on the Chris Benoit tragedies, the double murder-suicide from all the way back in 2007. And we knew that this was going to be a very hard road to relive, and it's going to dig up some very unpleasant memories. But based on the success of the first season and how well all of these documentaries were put together, I think we all collectively were awaiting this release just to potentially maybe even give us some closure or a little bit more information on what still to this day and will forever be the darkest day in the history of wrestling. So I did not want to rush up here and do a review right away. I saw both of these parts probably before most. I saw part one when it was released a little bit early on Vice Channel's YouTube page, and then I got an early link to part two. So I saw this all the way back last weekend. It was just so impactful. And as a wrestling fan, and I'm sure I can speak for so many of you, it was gutting to watch, and it was difficult to watch. And I remember after both parts, each part of 1 and 2, after it was over, literally just sitting in dead silence, trying to absorb it, trying to take it all in, because it's just really painful to go back and relive this stuff. And I have a lot of personal memories, which I've gotten into in the past. I'll probably discuss a little bit here. But this was quite the documentary, and I think it was extremely painful for most wrestling fans out there, and you can only imagine the pain that we feel, what, the immediate family members have had to go through and had to endure over these past 13 years, and just an unimaginably heartbreaking story with what happened with Chris and his family and the whole circumstances around that. I took 2 full looks at this documentary, watched both parts twice each, because this was one situation, this was one topic where I didn't want to be that YouTuber that just rushed up here and got a video out right away. To me, I felt like I owed this situation a lot more than that, to really kind of organize my thoughts, to really kind of absorb everything, and try to give you guys the best take possible from my perspective, instead of just rambling off some comments. To me, this situation is still one that cuts very deep for me. There's only a few things like this in wrestling that, I think still haunt me and have left holes in my heart. This is one of them, and, Owen Hart being another one, which is ironically another episode in season 2 that's going to be extremely difficult to watch, but for completely different reasons. The Chris Benoit tragedies are just a combination of sadness and anger and frustration and confusion. Literally every emotion imaginable comes at the result of these horrific tragedies and what went down, and how it still isn't any less shocking today, 13 years later, than it was back in the summer of 2007 when all of this took place. So what we're going to do here tonight is basically just review the entire documentary. I made my notes. I wrote down the points I wanted to discuss and some of the things I wanted to make sure we got into, and we're going to kind of take another unpleasant look back at the darkest day in the history of professional wrestling, and how much sadness surrounds this whole ordeal, and how absolutely gutting and heartbreaking it was to have to relive this in this documentary form, and having to hear these stories told many times for the first time. And that's one thing I want to say right off the bat here. Everybody involved in the Dark Side of the Ring documentary, the production crew and the staff there at Vice, they did a really good job. I really liked the angle that they used here. It was kind of no nonsense. Chris Jericho was the narrator for this thing, and he warns right up front that if you're going to try to accuse him of glorifying a murderer or anything like that, just shut the fuck up and stop watching now. These were things that needed to be talked about, and there were certain perspectives on this whole situation that needed to be shared. So he was basically like, buckle up, it's about to get real. And holy shit, he wasn't lying. My God, this was just unbelievable to watch. So, like I said, it was a 2-parter. Came out a couple of days apart. They began part 1 basically just talking a lot about Chris. It was a lot about Chris and Nancy, but they really highlighted Chris's early life. And a lot of that stuff we as wrestling fans already knew. It was ironic. I put up on Twitter just a couple of days before Part 1 was released here dealing with the quarantine. I popped in Chris Benoit's WWE DVD documentary that was released all the way back in 2004, 15 or 16 years ago now, right after he won the title at WrestleMania 20. And that was hard enough to watch, and that was prior to his death, where everything was kind of, happy and told a really nice story. It was just heartbreaking to see like how great he was and what would eventually wind up happening to him. My gut gets turned in knots every single time I see footage of him hugging Eddie Guerrero in Madison Square Garden at WrestleMania 20. Probably one of those beautiful moments in the history of wrestling, probably the most beautiful moment in all of wrestling's 100-plus year history, and we can never appreciate it as wrestling fans. It has been wiped from the slate. And those were the reactions and the emotions watching that documentary from 2004 were bringing out of me. And then 2 or 3 days later, Vice drops Part 1 here. Oh, man, I made a couple of tweets about it and just how heartbreaking it was to have to watch and sit through this. And that was only Part 1, and then Part 2 would be even harder to watch, in my opinion. Because that's when it really got gnarly with a lot of the details of what exactly transpired that horrible weekend. So Part 1 here just basically laid the foundation, let you know who Chris was, who Nancy was, who the key players here were. And like I said, a lot of the stuff as wrestling fans we already knew. We knew Chris's early life. He idolized the Dynamite Kid. And I've said for years, as somebody that grew up watching the Dynamite Kid, and I always was mesmerized by how amazingly perfect Chris Benoit emulated the Dynamite Kid. Dynamite was his favorite wrestler. He wanted to be just like him. But he had not only did he have the wrestling style down pat, he just happened to be like the exact same size. When you look at them, same height, same build, same length of arms. They wrestled almost identical. Chris Benoit just must have studied hours and hours of Dynamite tapes, the way he would punch, the way he would kick, the way he would sell, especially the way he would sell, the way he would deliver that snap suplex. They were just carbon copies. It still just blows my mind to this day. And I have to say this, in no disrespect whatsoever to Dynamite and his ring ability, I think Chris Benoit was better. I think Chris Benoit not only was able to become as good as Dynamite, I think he was better. I think there were certain parts of his in-ring technique that he did a little bit better than Dynamite. I think all of that stuff that Benoit did looked a little bit crisper, sharper, smoother. Basically, it was taking Dynamite Kid's playbook and improving upon it. And I thought Benoit kind of made a much more polished version of a Dynamite Kid, and he got real good real quick. So they kind of picked it up there, kind of just glossing over a lot of his young life and how he got into wrestling, and then talked about his time in Japan. And that's where he met Eddie Guerrero and all of their matches together as Black Tiger and Wild Pegasus and Pegasus Kid. I have a lot of those tapes. Those were some of the first tapes I got when I was like in my first 2 years of tape trading. A lot of Japan stuff and seeing Benoit work under the mask and without the mask against Eddie. I have several of those matches on tape that all look like shit. They were in horrible quality, but I had them because I was following him around in the magazines and everything, and I knew that he was in ECW, and I remember hearing the stories of Benoit trying to decide where to sign. He famously worked a bunch of dark matches in WWE, had some tryouts in 1995, but ultimately chose to sign with WCW because that's where a lot of the cruiserweights were going, and that was just a better option for him. And I'll never forget watching WCW. I watched it live as it happened. I think it was Saturday night. I don't think it was Nitro. I think it was WCW Saturday night where Benoit shows up in the limo and he looks up and he goes, WCW, where the big boys play. And I remember being like, shit, I was hoping he'd go to WWE, but anyway, he's there now. So best of luck to him, basically. So I remember all of that vividly. But this is really where they started illustrating how insane the work ethic of Chris Benoit was. Chris Jericho tells a famous story from Japan, a match that the two of them were having. And Jericho went for a spinning heel kick or something and completely missed Benoit's head by about a full foot. And it was no big deal. Benoit took the bump. They finished the match. And then after the match, Jericho says he found him in the back doing a bunch of Hindu squats, doing 500 squats. And he's like, what are you doing? And he's like, I missed that kick. I didn't take the kick right. I didn't sell it right. And so I have to do squats. And Jericho's like, what, did they punish you? And he's like, no, I'm just doing them. I have to do them. And little stories like that really paint a kind of an insane picture of just how seriously Benoit took his profession and took his work, and that's why all this makes it even more sad. And as what Jericho would mention in part 2, that, what would wind up happening here, this would kill Chris if he knew the damage he did to wrestling. They really made it known that he had a different level of work ethic than most, and he took his shit seriously. And his relationship with Eddie, started in Japan. And apparently they didn't get along right at first, but then formed a bond and really became best friends. And they showed a lot of heartbreaking images of the two of them. A lot of selfies that they took, one on a beach pier, another one on a beach, a lot of pictures from the road. And you can just really see, like, in Chris's eyes, like, how much, his relationship with Eddie Guerrero meant to him. Because that's your family. When you're on the road so much, you have to stick with people that you have the most in common with and that you trust and that you care about. And Eddie and Chris were like each other's road wives. And, that was probably helpful to both of them. Around this time in the documentary, they introduce Sandra. Sandra is the only living sibling of Nancy Benoit. She's the only family member interviewed for this. None of Nancy's other family was interviewed. She talked about how Nancy met Kevin Sullivan and how that whole relationship started. And they really did a good job, I thought, and I was really happy they did this because I feel like Nancy has kind of been forgotten in all of this, especially from a WWE perspective, who never want to really refer back to or talk about this situation or Benoit at all. And I feel like there was a wonderful human being lost in all of this and somebody that has a lot of history in wrestling. I remember woman. I've got magazines with all sorts of spreads of her from back in the day. So she was one of the hot ladies of wrestling back in the 80s. And she had a really good look, and she paired well with Kevin Sullivan, and she did an excellent job of kind of being that satanic fallen angel type of character. And she became a valet and a manager, and it's an art that really no longer exists anymore in wrestling. And she was one of the pioneers of it. So I was appreciative that the Dark Side of the Ring folks focused on Nancy and at least inform some fans that might not know, how important she was to wrestling and how good she really was. She deserves to be recognized for that. She deserves to go into the Hall of Fame. I feel like her legacy has also been tarnished and can never really be celebrated or never really be talked about just because of these horrific circumstances of her death and everything surrounding it. They go into great detail as well about Chris Benoit and what a loving family man he was. Everybody that they interviewed for this, and they interviewed some really key people here, I think. I should say that right up front. Not only did Chris Jericho narrate this thing, he was also interviewed for it. Chavo Guerrero was another wrestler that was interviewed, and so was Dean Malenko. And to hear all of them, including Nancy's sister Sandra and David Benoit, who just had some heartbreaking things to say, and we'll get into that later. To hear all of them talk about what a loving family man Chris Benoit was. Everybody said the same thing. He is the last guy in the world that you would expect to do this. Chris Jericho was quoted in the documentary saying if you lined up 100 people in a row and say, pick me out one that's going to kill his family, he would literally be the 100th person you picked. He'd be the last one you'd go to. It just wasn't in his makeup. It wasn't who he is. And that's why you saw WWE, without hesitation, the night that he died, go up with a 3-hour Chris Benoit tribute. Didn't even occur to them that he could have been behind this because that's not the Chris Benoit that anybody knew. They talk more about his relationship and friendship with Eddie Guerrero, and Eddie Guerrero, who had his own share of problems, which they chronicled. Vickie Guerrero was another person that was interviewed for this, and she told a lot of heartbreaking stories about Eddie and revisited some of his drug and alcohol issues and his several ODs that he had that ultimately led to the deterioration of his heart and his death. And she talked about how he had his troubles, but when he finally got rehired by WWE after they let him go and he started to turn his life around, he got really into religion and going to church and God. And he introduced Chris to that. And Chris was not a religious person up until that point. And Eddie had given him a Bible, and Chris started reading it. And, I've got my own opinions on that, too, which I might share a little bit later when we get into some of the horrible parts of this. But that kind of, I don't want to say raised a red flag, because regardless of whether or not you're religious or not, me personally, I am not. But I'm not against something that will make you a better person. I don't care what that is. If it makes you a better person, whatever you have to turn to make that happen, I'm in favor of it, whether I agree or believe or not. With somebody like Chris, I think that was something that might have played a role down the line when he really started to lose it, because his brain, as we'll talk about later, was in really, really, really bad shape. And I think that some of the things that he was reading in the Bible and some of the things that he was beginning to follow and believe in when you combine that with an already deteriorating brain, I think it was starting to mix a portion of the cocktail. And we're going to talk about the enormous cocktail that was concocted, I think, that was a part of Chris doing what he did. So many different factors coming to play and just combined to form this super disaster. And, like I said, I'm sure we'll get into that here in a bit. When they were talking about Eddie Guerrero, talking about the problems he had and talking about him cleaning himself up, they also had to talk about his death. And that was probably the hardest part of part one for me. I had paused it. I had to pause it and just take a deep breath, like, holy shit. That was so chilling to hear poor Chavo Guerrero, this poor man who's been an instrumental factor in both of these deaths, Eddie and Chris, the things that he's had to witness and endure. I mean, you really feel for Chavo. I mean, Chavo and Sandra and David Benoit, I think, in this documentary, I just, wish I could reach through the screen and hug them. What they've had to witness and be a part of is just, something that's, I would imagine, just haunts them forever. But it was not pleasant at all to hear Chavo retell the story of Eddie Guerrero's death. Now, we knew the basics of it. We knew Eddie was found in his hotel room. We knew where. We knew that, Chavo was there and was a part of it and all of that. But I don't think I remember ever hearing Chavo tell the story of him actually finding Eddie Guerrero and Eddie Guerrero kind of still being alive when he found him. They were supposed to get up and go work out, like 6 a.m. or something. And then the front desk calls Chavo and says, your uncle didn't answer his wake-up call. They go try to open the door, but the latch is on, so that means somebody's in there. They cut the latch, and Chavo finds Eddie face down on the bathroom floor and rolls him over and tries to talk to him, and he gurgles a little bit and just passes right there in Chavo's arms. And then Chavo, having just watched his uncle or his brother essentially die in his arms, then he has to relay that information to Chris Benoit, and Chris Benoit's reaction was just absolute, pure, unadulterated devastation. Chavo says he let out a big wail, big scream through the phone, and it was just horrible. And I remember reading the story the morning. It was in November. I remember it was pretty close to Thanksgiving, if I remember right. And I pulled up OneWrestling.com back in the day. I probably even had dial-up internet back then in 2005. I don't remember. And I saw right there on the top, Eddie Guerrero passes away. And I remember being so disgusted. Not at Eddie, but just disgusted at, my God, you got to be kidding me. Another one? And now it's like one to this level. I mean, this is a star. This is a guy that was champ a year ago. And I remember just being like, I'm done. I've told that story before. Eddie's death made me kind of stop watching wrestling closely for a couple of years. Now, I watched it. I still watched the WrestleManias. I still, for the most part, knew what was going on in the pay-per-views, and I eyeballed TV. But in terms of being the fan that I am, like I am now, and like I used to be prior to this, I wasn't. I was just like, I'm like, what is going on with wrestling? One after another, these people are dying. I wasn't over Owen's death yet. And this thing has to come along. And I think I remember just getting fed up, because 2003 was like a sweeping year of just crazy ones. It was like Hawk, and it was Crash Holly, and it was Miss Elizabeth, and all these people that are so young and should not be dying. And so I remember Eddie's just really just taking the wind out of my sails. I'm like, I'm fucking done with this shit. I'm so done with the tragedies. And boy, I didn't know how wrong I would be. I would be far from done. And I don't think we're ever going to be done. But hearing Chris's reaction to this and how he took it, that was pretty much the beginning of the end for him. That was the beginning of his downward spiral, because that by this point, like we're going to talk about in part 2 with his brain, you would think that a lot of this brain damage had already well since begun by the time Eddie died. And Chris had formed this really strong bond with him. I think Eddie was really helping him get through a lot of things. And for him to have to lose him now hit him really, really hard. And they talked about the funeral. That's what Chris Jericho said. He goes, I saw Benoit at the funeral and gave him a hug. And, he was crying so hard, he left this gigantic wet stain on my suit. And all the WWE guys had to leave right after the funeral to hop on a flight to go on a European tour and go on the road. And Benoit should have been off for 3 months. At least, to deal with this. And, instead he had to go right back on the road and be right back to doing business, and had to get in the ring when his best friend just passed away. And why WWE? Nobody thought to say, you know what, Benoit, you're not going on this trip. We're going to send you home. Don't even ask him if he needs time off, because he's going to say no. You're going to send him home. You're going to say, you are not working on this tour. You are to go home. That is an order. If you come on the tour, you're fired. Go home, take some time, process this, grieve, and come back. But nope, they didn't do that. Didn't even probably cross their minds that Chris Benoit is literally had a knife just tore right through him. So I think that was probably really the beginning of his mental breakdown and his mental just downward spiral. Vickie Guerrero talks about how Nancy was a big part in kind of helping her get back on her feet. Vickie Guerrero had to deal with this death as well. And Nancy was there. Nancy was at the house to pull her out of bed and take her to lunch and get her dressed and get her in the shower and just really help kind of support her and be there for her. And Chris was around for that. And they said that he was found in parts of the house crying in Eddie Guerrero's bed, sitting in the gym, where Eddie Guerrero worked out and just crying on the weight bench. He would go to towns. Oh, last time I was here, Eddie was here. Go to another town. Last time I was here, Eddie was here. Everything was just Eddie, Eddie, Eddie. And Jericho tells the story like he should have known. Like that was kind of the beginning of, him really starting to unravel from a mental perspective because he no longer had that rock, that shoulder to lean on. And I think Eddie helped guide Benoit probably in a time where he really needed it. So losing him was just a devastating thing for Benoit. So then it gets a little worse because now we have to start talking about the circumstances of what went on and how Chris eventually wound up doing what he did. And a few of them started talking about some of the behavioral changes in Chris. Sandra mentioned that he seemed to be becoming increasingly paranoid. There were lots of fights with Nancy. There were rumors of some domestic incidents. Nancy, I believe, at one point did file a restraining order. And they were having some fights and they weren't getting along, and it wasn't a perfect family all the way around. They had their issues. But on top of that, you had Chris Benoit beginning the stages of brain damage from severe CTE and unprotected chair shots to the head and the overall style that he wrestled. You combine that with drinking and some drugs. You combine that with the grief of Eddie Guerrero, and you combine that with the testosterone and the steroids. And the cocktail is starting to come together. And all of those things combined, I think, really led Chris into a really dark place where he was becoming more closed off. Everybody talked about how there were some changes in his behavior, but that was pretty much behind closed doors. At work, he was still all business and could still go in the ring and go. And he was somehow this was able to fly under the radar. Nobody realized that this guy needs some help. Somebody needs to check on him kind of thing. And he was able to keep that from everybody, all the while going quietly insane in his own head. And then we have to hear about the horrific story, and this is how part one wrapped up pretty much, of discovering that Benoit has passed away. Now, poor Chavo, less than a year and a half prior to this, Chavo Guerrero has to watch Eddie Guerrero die in his own arms and be a part of that, and which is going to haunt him forever. Now his other friend, Chris, is having some serious problems, and he talked about the phone call that he got from Chris prior to their weekend shows in Texas, where it was like a house show and then a pay-per-view, and I think Benoit, was supposed to work with CM Punk. And he said that Chris called him and said that he's not going to be making the show because Nancy and Daniel both have food poisoning. And that's when it hits you. That's when it hits you when you hear about that phone call to Chavo. You're like, wow, they were already dead by that point. They were already dead when he called Chavo. Chavo talked to this man on the other end of the phone when 2 dead bodies are in that house. Think of the weight this man must be carrying around with him. Go follow Chavo Guerrero on Twitter. Go tell him you love him. Right now. Pause this video. Please do it. I mean, he's an unbelievably strong man to have these things in his past. And so, basically, he says, okay, good luck or whatever to Chris Benoit, and Chris Benoit says he loves him. He says, Chavo, I love you. And Chavo says, he goes, that was weird. But again, he just went to the hotel. And that's when he got some strange text messages at like 5 a.m. And we've heard about these. I remember these came out the days of the murder, or shortly after the murder, maybe not the day of, but shortly after the murder, these texts were made known. Chavo talked about them, I think, in news interviews, that Benoit texted him in the middle of the night and said, the dogs are in the back, and the back door is unlocked or something like that, basically giving him instructions about what to do at the house. And then he gets another text message from Nancy's phone saying the same exact thing. So again, he's kind of like, well, that's weird, but it's the middle of the night, so I'm going back to bed, whatever. And then meets Scott Armstrong the next morning for breakfast, and Chavo says, I asked Scott, did you get a weird text message from Chris? And he goes, yeah, I actually did. And all the text messages said the same thing. So then they head to the arena, Corpus Christi, which is where I think the pay-per-view was. And that's when they show Johnny Ace the text messages, and apparently he gets a little mad at him, like, why didn't you tell us? And he's like, well, we're just trying to help him out or cover for him or whatever. And that's when they make the decision to call the authorities in Fayetteville, Georgia, and do a wellness check on the Benoit house. And that's when the discoveries are made, and they wrap up part one with Vince McMahon calling a talent meeting out to the ring, gets everybody around ringside, and makes the announcement that Nancy, Chris Benoit, and Daniel are all dead. And everybody just gasps. Vickie Guerrero loses her shit. Dean Malenko has to take care of her. And it's just the most insane blow you could ever imagine being dealt. Like, what the hell happened? And I think we all assume the same thing. Somebody broke in and killed him. Carbon monoxide leaked into the house. Never once, when I learned this news anyway, did I think for a minute that Benoit did this. And that's pretty much how they wrapped up part one. And I remember sitting there after it was over just saying, like, damn, that was crazy. I don't even know if I want to watch part two. But we got to get into part two. Part two goes into the details of, what was found by the detective that they interviewed, the one that was the first on the scene, who said that he had seen Benoit around town at the gym and stuff. And he went into extremely grim detail of these discoveries. He was the first one on scene. There was a neighbor there who apparently helps take care of the dogs when they're out of town. So she hopped the fence and took care of the dogs and got them secured, and then came running out screaming that Daniel was dead. So the police drew their weapons, entered the home, and he goes, that's when you notice the smell right away, because there were bodies in that house for a couple of days before Benoit took his own life, and they knew right away. And I'll tell you what, one of the eeriest things to see in this documentary were the photos, the police photos from the house. They didn't show any bodies or anything, but just to see the environment where all of this was happening, to see it in the middle of the daylight, sunshine coming in through the windows. It was a very clean, well-kept house, and you would have no idea that, a horrific mass murder has taken place in these very walls. And just seeing, like, Benoit's kitchen, seeing his living room, seeing his office, seeing Danielle's bedroom with a replica title with his name on it, Daniel Benoit, laying right there on the floor next to his bed, and out of frame, not in the picture, is probably the dead body of Daniel Benoit. And just seeing that, I was like, man, I've never really seen inside his house before. And, like, all these pictures are taken while these bodies are there. So it's like, at that very moment, Chris has got a weight cord wrapped around his neck. At that very moment, Nancy's wrapped in a sheet. And at that very moment, Daniel is face down in the bed, dead. It's just crazy. It was just an eerie sight to see. And they go into details, too, about how he did it. Nancy apparently was first. He wrapped a telephone cord or something around her neck and choked her and put his knee into her back and broke her spine. So to hear some of these details about, what was going on, and that Nancy was killed, I believe, on the Friday, and then it took him a whole nother day to kill Daniel. And he gave him a Xanax to relax him and then just suffocated his own son. Just to hear that makes my skin crawl, because this poor kid's laying in his bed having no clue that anything's wrong in the house, having no idea that his mom is dead in the other room. And he's just laying there probably just in innocent kid land, which is where all kids should be. And then his dad comes in and gives him a pill and kills him. This guy that we've seen endless amounts of pictures and home videos throughout this two-part documentary of him loving Daniel and kissing him and his family being his world. It just blows my mind and what must have been going on in Chris's head. Some of the other details that were not pleasant was the fact that he put a Bible next to each body, and that's what I touched on earlier on. And I'm not trying to say anything negative about religion. You guys know how I feel about it, but that's not what this is about. But I am saying that some of the things in the Bible and some of these stories, I don't know if it's really safe or healthy for somebody to be in such deteriorated mental state who already is probably having a difficulty distinguishing right from wrong and reality from fiction. To have one of these books that is filled with a lot of magic tricks might not be good. And they talked about the internet searches that were found, these chilling internet searches after Nancy and Daniel were killed. One of the searches was a passage in the Bible about resurrecting a little boy. And I'm like, well, what the fuck does that mean? Does that mean, like, after he did that to Daniel, he actually thought he could bring him back to life because of some story in the Bible? Imagine Chris Benoit actually Googling how to resurrect somebody from the dead. You can't resurrect somebody from the dead. They're dead. But Benoit might have thought otherwise because of what he was reading in that book. It's just a theory. I'm not saying it has to be true, but I don't think that was really, I think Eddie's gesture, because Eddie found the good in religion. Eddie used religion to really clean himself up, and it did wonders for Eddie Guerrero. But I think it might have had the opposite effect for Benoit. I don't know if it was necessarily helping him. I think it was giving him unrealistic things to believe in. Because when you take the life of your family like that, you have to think that in Benoit's head, he was trying to rationalize it as we will all be together. Based on what we know of Benoit, I would be willing to bet he was probably thinking that in his brain that had been turned into applesauce from chair shots. And when you combine that, like I said, with the steroid use and the alcohol, apparently right there next to Benoit's body, he took a half-drunk bottle of wine down there with him to the gym to kill himself. So this whole thing was like a bender. You know, it was a combination of his brain damage, combination of his grief over Eddie Guerrero, combination of his increasing paranoia. On top of that, the steroid use, the drug use, the drinking, and probably a fight with Nancy, and that all exploded into the biggest tragedy that wrestling has ever seen. He also left a suicide note saying that it was his time to leave this earth, things like that. So he knew what he was doing. He was aware of what he had done, because it was so calculating that took place. You know, the fact that he went to bed in his own house with 2 dead bodies is crazy to me, and then woke up the next day. You know, I'm like, well, I'll try to Google how to resurrect Daniel, and then if I can't, I'm going to kill myself. The type of delusion that must take. This has to be 100% a situation where he was just not in his right mind. And that would start coming to light in the upcoming days and weeks. So we had to sit through those grim details, you know, and then we had to hear about people like David, people like Sandra finding out the news. David tells the story of finding out, says his mom was getting a bunch of calls because David is the son of Chris from his previous marriage. And his mom was getting a ton of calls from police department. They said, you have to come down to the station. And they were told the news at the station. And David freaked out, said he tried to hit the cop, and the cop took him for a walk. And, you know, it was just gutting to hear his pain. And on top of that, David looks exactly like Chris. It's almost hard to look at his face. I mean, every time this kid looks in the mirror, he sees his dad. And anytime anybody looks at this kid, they see Chris Benoit. He's the spitting image of him, just a little bit smaller. And just to hear him tell this story, I mean, imagine from his perspective what this kid is going through. And I was like, where do you draw the line? This is my dad. I should never forgive him for what he did, but he's my dad. I loved him. He never showed me anything but love. He was my hero. He just had a really, really, really bad weekend. You know, where he committed unforgivable acts in the span of 48 hours. But up until that point, he had a great 40 years, and he was a loving father, and not the type of person you would think would ever hurt his kids. So, and I said that before, I'm like, thank God David wasn't there. What would have happened if 14-year-old David would have been in the house? How would have Benoit handled that? What would Benoit have done to him? So hearing those details weren't fun. They talked about WWE and their reaction to it, which was the exact same reaction as the fans. That not one of us thought that this was any sort of murder at all. Never even crossed our mind. Didn't cross my mind. And they talked about making the announcement on Raw and doing the big tribute to Chris Benoit, where everybody put him over for being a great human being, and how they'd trust Chavo famously on that Monday Night Raw said he would trust him with his kids, not knowing that Benoit had just killed his own kid. I've told the story about that as well, how I learned of the news, because I was moving. I was switching apartments. And I was unpacking, so I didn't have any access to the internet because I was still hooking everything up. But I did have my TV hooked up because even though I wasn't really watching a lot of wrestling at the time, I did see the previous episode where Vince McMahon exploded in the limousine. So I wanted to see what was going to happen on Raw because apparently they were going to do a death angle with Vince. So I remember hooking up my TV so I could have Raw on while I was unpacking my new house. And I was in the other room, and Raw's about to come on the air. And I've got the TV on pretty loud, but I'm all the way in the other room around the corner, no view of the TV. And Raw comes on the air, and I hear from the other room Vince McMahon's voice. And I'm like, what the fuck? He's supposed to be dead. And I walk out, and I see that he's standing there in a... ironically, as of the recording of this, we're currently undergoing the huge coronavirus pandemic here in the world. And Vince was standing there in an arena that doesn't look a whole lot different than what we're seeing right now currently in wrestling, just a completely empty arena. And I'm like, where are the fans? Vince is supposed to be dead, but here he is. What the fuck? And I hear the words come out of his mouth that Chris Benoit, his wife Nancy, and son Daniel are dead. I just sat right down. I'm like, what the F? as if I wasn't fed up enough after Eddie died, I have to hear this. And I'm just like, you've got to be kidding me. But when he said the entire family, because at first, if they just would have said Benoit died, I'm like, great, another overdose, or something is what I would have said. Or another situation like, like Davey Boy or like Eddie Guerrero, who died young because of all their previous bad decisions in life. Just put it that way. That would have probably been my first response had it been Benoit only. But when he said it was the whole family, I'm like, Jesus, what the hell happened? I thought they were murdered. Just assume they were murdered. Never once did it even cross my mind that Benoit was behind it. And that's why we saw WWE had the same thought that most of us fans did. They ran a 3-hour tribute show because back in those days, Raw was still 2 hours. I'm pretty sure this was like a special 3-hour event on the USA Network. So they aired not just 2 hours, but 3 hours of nonstop Benoit tributes, showed his greatest matches, thoughts from all of the roster members, Jerry Lawler and JR, sharing their memories of Chris Benoit. Everybody was just devastated, and they lost a friend, a brother, a peer, and somebody that was very loved and very, very, very respected. I mean, very respected. And then, in about a 24-hour period after this happened, the events and the facts of the case become apparent. And I remember reading the next morning, because by then I had hooked up my computer, and I got up the next morning and I immediately went online to look at more news on the Benoit murders, because I'm still very shook by it. Because I loved Benoit. I was a big Benoit mark. I've seen a lot of Benoit's great matches and some of his great matches in person. And I was just devastated by this whole thing. And I remember seeing the headline. I can't remember if it was also from One Wrestling. It might have been Bill Apter or a website like that. And I'll never forget, it said in red lettering, it said Chris Benoit apparently murdered wife and son and took his own life. And I'm like, it floored me. I'm like, excuse me? That doesn't even sound right. And that's when I started watching a lot of TV, watching a lot of news, and it was covered everywhere across all forms of media. And I was getting increasingly more frustrated because every single thing you saw was about steroid abuse and shit like that and roid rage. At that time, WWE was in full damage control. They were trying to go out there and say, no, we cannot just automatically assume this is roid rage. And looking back, it's kind of shitty for them to be more concerned with damage control than actually some of the victims here in this case. Jim Ross talks about having to go to Nancy's funeral as the WWE's lone representative. And he was confronted by Sandra. She threw him out, didn't want him there. Because in their mind, Chris Benoit and his style and the work and the load that was put on him was a contributor to him doing this. And the last people in the world that would be welcome at that funeral is going to be somebody from WWE. David went on to say that Chris Benoit's funeral was very private and they told no one about it. And they asked Sandra if anybody in the WWE reached out to her and took care of her and the family after it happened. And she said no, nobody from WWE ever contacted her. And same thing with David. He said the only people that reached out to him was Chris Jericho and Chavo Guerrero Jr. And when you hear shit like that, you're like, shame on you, WWE, you assholes. They were more concerned with damage control. They were more concerned with preserving the image of their company that already does not have a great image to begin with. That was their number one focus. That was their number one concern. And they literally didn't give a shit about anybody else. These people are victims too. WWE did the right thing and really took care of Vickie Guerrero, even though they treated her like shit from a character standpoint on TV. Giving her a job and making sure she had income for her family after Eddie left, I thought was a nice gesture. But they wanted to distance themselves so much from the Benoit murders by completely erasing Chris from all of the record books, never mentioning his name, never talking about him again. And they probably felt that if they reached out and took care of the family, that would create and generate some more press. And that wasn't fair. They should have been there for those guys, man. They should have made sure that David had everything he needed. Everything he needed. They should have made sure that he should never want for anything. And they should take care of him. Especially David. Sandra, at least she's a grown woman, and yes, WWE should have reached out, especially to Nancy's family, and make sure they're okay and offered to help in any way possible. At least Sandra's a grown woman. She can take care of herself. She can deal with this. David's a kid, man, and it's just, it's mind-blowing that WWE's priorities in some cases can be so ridiculously out of whack. You know what I mean? And that left us basically with just trying to answer the question, why? Why did this happen? The media was talking about a lot of things, including Benoit's diary to Eddie, because when Benoit was dealing with the grief of losing Eddie Guerrero. Somebody had suggested he get a diary so he can write to him. And in that diary, he was saying things to Eddie like, I'm going to be with you soon. And that's when you know that, something wasn't right in his head. And the media was so hell-bent on spinning it in the roid rage direction when that wasn't the only cause. Steroids did have a factor. Absolutely. He was doing them. It was very eerie to see the text messages that were revealed on part 2 between Nancy and Chris, where she's calling him out for it. She goes, these things are fucking you up. They're making you extremely temperamental, and they're affecting your behavior. You need to get off of these drugs. And she was right. Unfortunately, that was just one of the many things that was wrong with Chris. And that's when he really started going downhill. Sandra had to reveal a story about abuse between Chris and Nancy, and we knew that was a possibility. I had no idea that Johnny Grunge lived right down the road from them. Apparently, he was involved in this and helped get Chris out of there and take him to a hotel. And Chris had to use Sandra as a contact to get to Nancy and say, please tell her to let me come to the house so we can work it out. And she agreed, and then Chris went back and they got back together. And Johnny Grunge had passed away about a year before Benoit did this. So even Johnny was gone by the time this had all happened. So that's when they bring in Chris Nowitzki, and I was really hoping they would bring him in for this because he's an unsung hero in this whole situation. Not that this situation is good and has any heroes, but I'm really glad that he stepped up. He does not seem like the same kid that I saw on Tough Enough. When he was on Tough Enough, I just thought he was a cocky bastard. And, he's a big piece of this story. And he had famously, when he got signed after the Tough Enough, he had gotten a bunch of concussions to the point where he was basically forced into an early retirement. And he was already a Harvard graduate, very smart guy. And that's when he started really studying brain injuries and CTE. And, he's become one of the leaders in that type of research. And he said, he called Benoit's father. He called Chris's dad. And he goes, I couldn't believe it. With all the media attention, I wasn't expecting to get an answer. I just called for the heck of it. And he picked up on the second ring. And he told him his theory. He goes, look, I think your son had severe brain damage. And I think that probably played a large role in why he did what he did. And is it okay if I get a piece of his brain and analyze it and study it? And he agreed, which thank God that he did. And Chris Nowitzki went on to describe, CTE and what it is, and confirmed that it absolutely does change your behavior and who you are. We have seen that in football, a lot in football. And he talked about some of the cases, about the one guy that went out of his mind, heard voices in his head, and led cops on a high-speed chase and died in a fiery crash. Junior Seau here in San Diego killed himself, and he knew his head was fucked up. He purposely shot himself in the chest in order to preserve his brain. There's been many cases like this, especially in football, to where some people are really starting to lose it and be completely unaware and in no control of their actions or behavior. And when they released their findings of Chris Benoit's brain, not only was he found to have CTE, he was found to have severe CTE, severe brain damage in portions of the brain, giant pockets of damage in parts of your brain that determines and affects behavior and personality and mood. And that right there is your big piece of this puzzle. And when you combine that with everything else Chris had going on, with dealing with the tragedy they had to deal with, abusing alcohol, drugs, steroids, being in a volatile relationship with his wife, all of these things coming together, and his brain just continuing to melt. And there's just no way that weekend that he was in his right mind. But does that excuse it? That's what's just tough. When somebody commits such a horrific act, you're like, I don't care if he has brain damage or not. Think about that from a wrestling fan's perspective. Because one thing you'll notice in wrestling is that a lot of people are sympathetic to Benoit. And there is a part of me that is sympathetic to him, absolutely. But just given the horrific nature of this, it's hard to really forgive him. But you'll notice that in wrestling, you still have people to this day that think he should be in the Hall of Fame. Imagine what a brainless idiot you have to be to even think that's possible for 1 second. I've never even really acknowledged that question in Q&As and stuff because it's so absurd. If anybody believes he belongs in the Hall of Fame, then you need to have yourself checked for CTE, because it ain't going to happen, ever. You can say, well, just judging his body of work, he's a Hall of Famer. You're right, but you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and make a rule right now that double murder disqualifies you, okay? So let's just leave that alone. But you will notice that he does have his sympathizers, and you will see that a lot in the wrestling community because we all watched Chris. We all watched him wrestle, and he was amazing. He was one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. of all time in terms of what he could do and how much I appreciated his work and how good his shit looked. We always get asked that question as wrestling fans. If you had to show a non-wrestling fan a match or a wrestler and say, this is why I like it. You know, Chris Benoit is a guy that I would choose to show a match to a stranger to because he's so intense and he's so good and he's so believable and he looks so real. I feel like if I show somebody a Chris Benoit and Kurt Angle match, they're not going to criticize me as hard for being a wrestling fan because they're going to say, damn, those guys are pretty good. And Benoit was one of those guys. So if you notice the type of sympathy he gets, I pose this question to you. Imagine this entire documentary takes place, but instead of a professional wrestler, all of the facts of this are the same. All the players here are the same, but instead of professional wrestling, it's a form of entertainment that you care nothing about, or this person isn't a celebrity at all. It's just Joe Blow. And maybe it's one of these Barbara Walters 2020 specials or something where they just tell a story of a guy who went out of his mind and killed his wife, his son, and himself. Imagine if this was a complete stranger you had never heard of Chris Benoit in your life before. Would we still have that same opinion? I'd say probably not. I'd say most of you would say, no, fuck that guy. He killed his family. I don't care what was wrong with his brain. That's unforgivable. You know, so it's just different from a wrestling fan's perspective. We have a much different view on this because, you know, we have so much love in our heart for who Chris was as a performer. And pretty much everybody on this documentary said the same thing. Chavo and Jericho and Malenko, they said he was great. Just this one weekend ended his entire legacy. This one weekend ended us ever being able to speak his name. And they talked about how WWE just completely blacklisted him and erased him as best they could from wrestling history. And that's a shame. Jericho says that's probably one thing that would kill Benoit the most, is knowing he did that. So I felt, for one, that the documentary did a really good job of touching on all of the issues. They didn't focus on just the brain damage. They didn't focus on just the steroids. They didn't focus on just the marital problems. They knew what I think we all knew deep down, and this was a combination of a lot of things. And unfortunately, a lot of these things probably in retrospect could have been addressed, and maybe some people could still be here. Vickie Guerrero at the end of the documentary says, you know, if Chris wanted to kill himself, then so be it. But he had to take his family with him. It's so fucked up. And Sandra talks about how, you know, that one issue of domestic abuse and how she feels guilty now for putting them back in touch and being instrumental in getting them back together, because had she not, that might have been the end of it. They would have gotten divorced and Chris still would have gone on to have problems, but Nancy and Daniel might be alive today. And I fully believe that. You know, and had this never happened, I can guarantee 100% that if these tragedies never happened, that Chris Benoit right now in 2020 would have severe dementia. I think he would be in a horrible mental place just with his brain damage. If he just never was driven to the point of murder and he actually stayed alive, I think Chris Benoit would be in a really bad place right now in terms of who he would be with his brain. He would not be himself. And he'd probably be institutionalized, and he might not even know where he was. Chris chose to be that type of worker. Chris chose to put his profession before anybody else, and he and his brain paid the price. So that, in and of itself, is Chris's decision. Even though it's horrible, it was his decision to do that. It was his decision to work that style. And it was his decision to do that to his body. So had he not committed these horrible acts, he would likely be suffering the consequences of his work style to this day and be in a really bad way. But at least Nancy and Daniel would be here. How old would Daniel be today? Would he be like 19 or something? Forgot how old he was when he died, but he'd be probably creeping up close to 20 years old now. And think about that. You know, this kid should be going to college. Daniel should be going to college. We shouldn't be remembering how he died 13 years ago. This kid should be beginning his life with another 80 years left to live. But instead, you know, it's just a shame. This was tough to watch, man. I ain't gonna lie. They tried to provide us a little bit of comfort at the end. Chris Jericho put David and Sandra in touch with each other because they hadn't spoken in years. They hadn't spoken since before this happened. And just because of situations with the family, and, you know, Sandra was under the impression that they didn't want anything to do with her, and probably vice versa. But Jericho kind of reached out and bridged the gap there, put him in touch. And they showed footage of the two of them attending All Out last August for AEW. And they showed some backstage footage of them talking to Jericho after his match. There was a really heartbreaking moment kind of near the end where David breaks down and he's comforted by Chavo and Sandra, who are both there in the room, and give him a hug, and you can kind of hear him mumbling like it's too real. Yeah, and just watching that, man, it was just, you might as well just ripped my heart out and flushed it down the fucking commode. I mean, just watching that was one of the most painful things as a wrestling fan I've ever had to see. So, props to Sandra and David both for just immense bravery there, especially David. Sandra's an adult, and Sandra was saying some things. I'm like, yeah, it seems like there's probably parts in her life where she's been a hot mess before. But David was just such a kid, and I feel for him 100 times more just because he was just a kid, and he's got to live with this, forever. And I'm glad that he's got people like Jericho and others who are going to reach out and be there for him. And he still loves wrestling. He still loves wrestling, still says that his dad is a hero. And I remember a couple of years ago, there was talk of him wanting to become a wrestler. But, think about that. Not only did Benoit ruin so many things about wrestling, he ruined his son's chance of ever getting in the business. Like if David was serious about being a wrestler, and I know he thought about it, and I know he tried or was thinking about trying, his name and the way he looks exactly like Chris. They're identical. So for him to become a wrestler, he's going to be David Benoit, and he's going to have that name attached to him. Nobody's going to want, WWE's never going to bring him on. I mean, I'm glad to see AEW reaching out, but just that name attached to him, he's going to have so much shit following him around that he's not going to deserve. And he even talked about that in the documentary. He's like, screw him. People talking shit behind my back or bullying me or whatever. People are always going to have to say something about it, and it's not his fault. He had nothing to do with what his dad did. And if he wants to get into the business, simply by using his real name, he's going to have critics, and he's going to have people giving him shit. And that's not fair, but it's also reality. It might not be fair, but life isn't fair. And what Benoit did has now put his son in a horrible spot to where he can probably never truly pursue a realistic career in pro wrestling based on his last name. And that's Benoit, and that's Chris's fault. And that sucks for David. He didn't deserve that either. I was surprised to hear the closing of the documentary with Nancy's sister Sandra actually saying that she wants to forgive Chris Benoit. She's not there yet, but one day she hopes to forgive him. And I think a lot of that is based on the facts of the case. This wasn't a cold-blooded murderer. This was a very mentally lost man that didn't know what he was doing, and he wasn't in his right frame of mind. And a lot of things had to do with that. A lot of it was his own doing, even though I believe he didn't have control over his actions, I believe he did it to himself. He shouldn't have been on a drinking bender when they talked about going through the house and there's just empty beer cans and wine bottles all over the house. He shouldn't have been doing that. He should have known better. But his brain, he wasn't making the decisions of a rational human being. And 3 lives were lost as a result. And it's sad. It's still the most horrible thing. I still can't believe wrestling survived it. And I went on the defensive after that. 3 years later, I started the YouTube channel, and I was very much a defender of John Cena because I don't think the fans really understood why he was there and why he was in the position that he was. I'm like, if you assholes cannot see that the result of this double murder has caused WWE to really, if they want to survive as a company, they cannot promote that type of violence anymore because it produced a double murderer. So they had to go in the PG direction. They had to put a squeaky clean guy on top. How many times has John Cena been hit with a wellness policy violation? How many times has John Cena been pulled over for a DUI? How many times has John Cena had an overdose or abused his wife or anything like that? Never. John Cena was exactly who the company needed. That change needed to happen. And all I heard back in the day is WWE's just for lame little kids and this PG nonsense. And I'm like, if you're that thick-headed to not be able to understand why this is happening, to me, this should be incredibly easy. It should be one of the easiest things in the world to understand. But not to these fans. They just thought WWE was just fucking down the toilet when they were in, like I said earlier, damage control mode. And they had to really change their business model and change and gear their product kind of in a different direction to get away from this insane violence that you would see of guys going through flaming tables and taking unprotected chair shots to the head and bleeding buckets on every single pay-per-view. That had to stop. Don't blame WWE for going PG. Blame Benoit, because that's the reality of it. So anyway, before I spiral into any more depression, I'll go ahead and wrap this commentary up. Like I said earlier, this has been recorded right in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic that's going on globally. It is currently March 27th, 2020. So if you do happen to be listening to this a year from now or a couple of years from now, hopefully the world has gotten back on its feet. Hopefully we are back to normal, because as of the recording of this, there are still a lot of unanswered questions, and a lot of us don't know where we're going to be and what we're going to be doing. And it's a very scary and strange and real time in the world, and I'm really curious what the future is going to hold. And with this video being on YouTube, it allows us to maybe look into the future. So if you're watching this in 2022, scroll down to the comments and let me know how life is in the world. You guys take care. If you have any things to share or any thoughts you want to talk about, please leave them in the comments below. I would love to hear what you have to say. If anybody's going to be an asshole or something down there, I'm going to have to delete it. But if you want to have some good discussions and share some Benoit memories and your thoughts on this documentary, I would love to read what you have to say. Thank you very much for listening. Rest in peace to the Benoit family.